A firing squad assembles in a German prison yard on July 23, 1944. The summer heat hangs heavy over Germersheim military prison, but the soldiers standing with rifles know this isn't about the weather. Their target isn't a spy, not a saboteur, not even an enemy soldier. It's their own general, a decorated officer who once saved an entire division from annihilation. Think about that for a moment. These are German soldiers, in the middle of the most devastating war in human history, and they're about to execute one of their own senior commanders. This is the story of Hans Graf von Sponeck, and if you think you know where this is going, you're probably wrong. Because this isn't a simple tale of heroism or villainy. It's not about a good man destroyed by an evil system, nor is it about justice finally catching up with a war criminal. The truth, as it often is in history, is far more complex and far more uncomfortable than any simple narrative we might want to impose on it. Before we judge, before we categorize, before we file this away as another World War II story, we need to understand what actually happened. Because the man who would face that firing squad had already faced impossible choices, choices that saved thousands of German soldiers' lives, choices that contributed to the deaths of thousands of civilians, and ultimately, a choice that would cost him everything. The path from decorated officer to executed prisoner doesn't run straight. It winds through the trenches of World War I, through the bitter peace of Versailles, through the rise of the Nazi regime, and through the frozen hellscape of the Eastern Front. It passes through moments of tactical brilliance and through participation in systematic murder. It encompasses both the preservation of military honor and cooperation with forces that had abandoned honor entirely. When those rifles fired in that prison yard, they weren't just ending a life. They were punctuating a story that challenges us to think about loyalty, duty, moral courage, and moral failure. They were creating a historical moment that would be interpreted and reinterpreted for decades to come. And they were raising questions that still haven't been fully answered. Hans Emil Otto Graf von Sponeck entered the world on February 12, 1888, in Dusseldorf, at a time when the German Empire stood at the height of its power. Born into minor nobility, his father was a Freiherr, or Baron. Young Hans grew up in a world where military service wasn't just expected, it was the very definition of honor. The army wasn't simply a career choice. For someone of his background, it was destiny written in blood and tradition. By the time he joined the German Imperial Army in the early 1900s, the institution had been shaped by decades of Prussian military tradition. This was the army of Moltke the Elder, of precise staff work, of the belief that wars were won by railroad timetables and mobilization schedules as much as by courage on the battlefield. Sponeck absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He wasn't the type of officer who led from the front with a saber in hand. He was the type who ensured that the men at the front had ammunition, food, and a coherent plan. When the Great War erupted in August 1914, Sponeck was a young officer thrown into the industrial meat grinder of the Western Front. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas became 4 years of unprecedented slaughter. He served as a staff officer, planning operations, coordinating logistics, trying to impose order on chaos. The Western Front taught harsh lessons about the futility of frontal assaults against machine guns, about the importance of artillery coordination, about how quickly carefully laid plans could dissolve into murderous confusion. He was wounded more than once, each injury a testament to the fact that even staff officers weren't safe from the industrial killing machine that modern war had become. Each wound meant time in field hospitals, watching men die from gas attacks, from infected wounds, from simple despair. Yet he returned to duty each time, climbing steadily through the ranks, earning decorations not for spectacular acts of heroism but for competent, methodical service. By November 1918, when the guns finally fell silent, he had reached the rank of captain. The armistice brought not peace but humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles gutted the German military, reducing it to 100,000 men, forbidding tanks, aircraft, and submarines. For career officers like Sponeck, it meant watching brother officers cashiered, seeing proud regiments disbanded, feeling the weight of national humiliation. Yet he stayed. While Germany writhed through hyperinflation, communist uprisings, and political chaos, Sponeck remained in uniform, part of the small professional corps that would keep military knowledge alive. The interwar years were lean and bitter. The Reichswehr, as the truncated German army was known, became an elite force by necessity. With so few positions available, only the most capable officers could remain. Sponeck spent these years studying, training, adapting. The limitations of Versailles forced German officers to think creatively, to maximize the potential of limited resources, to prepare for a future where Germany might again be a military power. He studied the new theories of warfare emerging from the last war's lessons, the importance of combined arms, the potential of mechanization, the concept of Bugungskrieg or war of movement, that would later be called Blitzkrieg. He learned from Hans von Sponeck, the architect of the new German army, who emphasized that a small, professional force could serve as the skeleton upon which a larger army could be built when the time came. By the mid-1930s, that time was clearly approaching. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 brought massive rearmament. The 100,000-man Reichswehr exploded into the Wehrmacht, and experienced officers like Sponeck suddenly found themselves in high demand. His specialty in staff work, his methodical nature, his ability to coordinate complex operations, all these skills were desperately needed as Germany built its new war machine. The late 1930s marked a crucial transformation in Sponeck's career, one that would plant seeds of both advancement and eventual destruction. His transfer to the Luftwaffe to help establish air landing units wasn't just a military reassignment, it was an entry into the complex political machinery of the Nazi state. The Luftwaffe belonged to Hermann Göring, and Göring's Luftwaffe was as much a political institution as a military one. Airlanding infantry represented a new concept in warfare. Unlike paratroopers who descended by parachute into enemy territory, airlanding troops were meant to be flown in transport aircraft to captured airfields, then deployed as conventional infantry. It required a different kind of thinking: how to rapidly secure airfields, how to hold them against counterattack with light forces, how to coordinate with paratroopers and conventional ground forces. Sponeck threw himself into this work with characteristic thoroughness. But it was during this period that Sponeck encountered the political realities of the new Germany in a very personal way. The Fritsch-Blomberg affair of 1938 sent shockwaves through the German military. War Minister Werner von Blomberg had married a woman with a criminal past, while Commander-in-Chief Werner von Fritsch was falsely accused of homosexuality. The scandal, likely orchestrated by Göring and Heinrich Himmler to remove military leaders skeptical of Nazi policies, resulted in a massive purge of the traditional military leadership. Sponeck appeared as a witness during the proceedings. The exact nature of his testimony remains unclear in historical records, but what is documented is that he crossed paths with Göring during this time. Göring, who presided over parts of the investigation, was not a man who forgot slights or challenges to his authority. Whether Sponeck's testimony somehow displeased the Reichsmarschall, or whether there was simply a personality conflict, a friction developed that would echo years later in a military courtroom. This period illuminated the fundamental tension within the Wehrmacht. The traditional officer corps, with their aristocratic backgrounds and conservative values, found themselves serving a revolutionary regime that viewed them with suspicion. They were needed for their expertise but distrusted for their independence. Officers like Sponeck had to navigate carefully between military professionalism and political reality. The work on air landing units continued against this backdrop of political intrigue. Sponeck helped develop doctrine, training regimens, and operational concepts that would soon be tested in battle. The units he helped create would play crucial roles in the coming war, seizing key objectives in Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But the techniques developed for military efficiency would later be employed in service of conquest and occupation. As 1939 dawned, war fever gripped Germany. The Wehrmacht had grown from 100,000 to over 1 million men. New weapons, new tactics, new confidence filled the ranks. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, unleashing the Second World War, Sponeck was ready to play his part. He had spent decades preparing for this moment, honing his skills, building his reputation as a capable, reliable officer. Yet the war that began in 1939 would be fundamentally different from the one Sponeck had fought as a young man. This wouldn't just be a war between armies, it would be a war of ideology, of racial hatred, of systematic extermination. The Wehrmacht, whether its officers acknowledged it or not, would become an instrument of genocide. And Sponeck, like every German officer, would have to decide how to navigate the moral abyss that was opening before them. The shadow of power, Göring's power, Hitler's power, the power of the Nazi state fell across every military decision. Professional military judgment increasingly had to accommodate political demands. Orders that would have been unthinkable in the old Imperial Army became routine. The distinction between military objectives and ideological goals blurred, then disappeared entirely. May 10, 1940. In the pre-dawn darkness, transport aircraft engines roared to life across German airfields. Operation Fall Gelb Case Yellow was beginning, and with it Germany's assault on Western Europe. Among the most ambitious elements of this massive offensive was the air landing operation in the Netherlands, an operation that would test everything Sponeck had helped develop in the previous years. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. While German armies crossed the Dutch border, paratroopers and air-landing infantry would strike deep behind enemy lines, seizing key airfields around The Hague. The goal was nothing less than to capture the Dutch government and royal family in a single stroke, decapitating Dutch resistance before it could properly organize. Sponeck, now commanding elements of the 22nd Air Landing Division, would help execute this aerial coup de main. The reality proved far messier than the plan. As Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft approached Dutch airfields, they met unexpected resistance. The Dutch, warned by the drone of approaching aircraft, had blocked runways with vehicles and obstacles. Transport planes attempting to land crashed into each other, skidded off runways, or were shot to pieces by anti-aircraft fire. Paratroopers found themselves scattered, fighting isolated battles in Dutch suburbs. Airlanding troops who managed to land intact found themselves immediately engaged in fierce combat. Sponeck's units landed at Ockenburg Airfield near The Hague, expecting to quickly secure the position and advance on the government quarter. Instead, they found themselves fighting for their lives. Dutch forces, recovering from initial surprise, counterattacked with unexpected ferocity. The neat operational plans dissolved into chaotic street fighting. German forces that were supposed to link up remained isolated, each group fighting its own desperate battle. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Dutch artillery zeroed in on captured airfields. Transport aircraft burning on runways prevented reinforcements from landing. Ammunition ran low. Wounded accumulated with no way to evacuate them. The airlanding troops, trained for rapid deployment and conventional infantry tactics, found themselves in exactly the kind of grinding positional warfare they were meant to avoid. It was in this chaos that Sponeck demonstrated the qualities that would define his military reputation. As communications broke down and units became isolated, he maintained control of his forces through personal leadership. When Dutch counterattacks threatened to overrun German positions, he organized defensive perimeters that held despite overwhelming pressure. When subordinate commanders panicked, he provided steady direction. At one point, Sponeck himself was nearly captured when Dutch forces overran his command post. He escaped with minutes to spare, reorganizing scattered troops and establishing a new defensive position. 4 hours that stretched into days, his forces held critical positions around the airfields, preventing complete disaster. Even as it became clear that the operation had failed in its strategic objectives, the Dutch government escaped to England, and the quick victory evaporated Sponeck's tactical leadership prevented the failure from becoming a massacre. The 4-day battle for the Netherlands ended with Dutch capitulation, but not because of the air-landing operations. Conventional German forces, advancing with tanks and artillery, ultimately forced Dutch surrender. The air-landing assault, despite its initial failure, had tied down Dutch reserves and created enough confusion to facilitate the conventional advance. Of the 4,000 air-landing troops committed to the operation, almost 40% became casualties. But they had survived, reorganized, and ultimately contributed to victory. For his leadership during this chaotic battle, Sponeck was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations. The citation recognized his decisive leadership under the most difficult conditions, and his role in maintaining cohesion when the situation appeared hopeless. The decoration marked him as one of the Wehrmacht's proven combat commanders, an officer who could maintain control when plans collapsed and chaos reigned. Yet this triumph carried within it the seeds of future tragedy. The same qualities that earned him the Knight's Cross: independent judgment, willingness to adapt plans to circumstances, the moral courage to make hard decisions under pressure, would later bring him into fatal conflict with a regime that increasingly demanded blind obedience over military competence. June 22, 1941, marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the war. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, wasn't merely another military campaign, it was the beginning of a war of annihilation. The orders flowing down from Hitler's headquarters made this crystal clear. This would be no conventional war governed by international law or military custom. This was to be a Rassenkrieg, a racial war where the normal rules simply didn't apply. Sponeck, now commanding the 22nd Infantry Division as part of Army Group South's advance into Ukraine, received these orders like every other German commander. 2 days before the invasion, on June 20th, his staff distributed guidelines about the treatment of captured Soviet soldiers. Jewish Red Army prisoners were to be separated from their comrades, marked for special treatment, a euphemism whose meaning would become horrifyingly clear. Political commissars were to be shot upon capture. Partisan activity, real or suspected, was to be met with massive retaliation. The division moved through Ukraine toward Crimea, and behind the advancing combat troops came the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads of the SS and security police. But the careful distinction that post-war German generals would try to draw between the clean Wehrmacht and the criminal SS was, in many cases, a fiction. Documents bearing Sponeck's signature show systematic cooperation between his division and the security police, the SD, and the Einsatzgruppen operating in his sector. On October 7, 1941, Sponeck issued orders for his division to assist Sonderkommando 10B in the apprehension and handing over of all Jews in captured towns. This wasn't a vague directive that could be misinterpreted. It was specific, operational cooperation in genocide. In Genichesk, Melitopol, and other Ukrainian towns, soldiers under Sponeck's command helped round up Jewish civilians, men, women, children, elderly, infants, and delivered them to the killing squads. The documentation is thorough, bureaucratic, and damning. In Melitopol alone, approximately 2,000 Jewish civilians were murdered in October 1941. The killing sites, the methods, the numbers, all carefully recorded in German reports that survived the war. These weren't battlefield casualties or collateral damage. These were systematic executions of civilians whose only crime was being Jewish. In December 1941, as his division participated in the capture of Feodosia and Crimea, more mass killings followed. Reports indicate that soldiers from the 22nd Infantry Division not only handed over Jews to the SS but in some cases participated directly in the shootings. The exact extent of direct participation versus merely facilitating murder remains debated by historians, but the moral distinction is negligible. Whether pulling the trigger or rounding up the victims, the result was the same. Anti-partisan operations provided another avenue for murder under the guise of military necessity. Orders circulated that essentially defined any Jew as a potential partisan, any civilian who looked suspicious as a legitimate target. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned. Civilians were hanged from telephone poles and trees as warnings to others. The doctrine of collective punishment meant that entire communities paid for any act of resistance. Sponeck's name appears on orders implementing these policies. Security measures, that meant summary execution. Cleansing operations, that meant murder. Resettlement actions, that meant deportation to death. The military language obscured but couldn't hide the reality of what was happening. His division was participating in the Holocaust, not as a peripheral activity but as an integral part of its operations in occupied territory. This participation wasn't unique to the 22nd Infantry Division or to Sponeck personally. Across the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht units were deeply complicit in genocide. Some commanders protested, some dragged their feet, some participated enthusiastically. Sponeck appears to have fallen into the large middle category, those who followed orders, cooperated as required, and didn't ask too many questions about what happened to the civilians they handed over. The psychological compartmentalization required to function in this environment was extraordinary. The same officers who ensured their men had warm clothes for the Russian winter were signing orders that condemned Jewish children to death. The same commanders who showed tactical brilliance in battle were organizing systematic murder behind the lines. Professional military competence existed alongside participation in genocide. By late December 1941, as winter gripped the Eastern Front with unprecedented severity, the 22nd Infantry Division found itself in Crimea, stretched thin, exhausted from months of continuous operations. The easy victories of summer had given way to desperate defensive battles. Soviet resistance had stiffened dramatically. And it was in this context, after months of conventional combat intermixed with participation in mass murder, that Sponeck would face the decision that would ultimately cost him his life. January 23, 1942. The military courthouse in Bucharest, Romania, had been hastily prepared for a special sitting of the Reich Court-Martial. The defendant, General Hans Graf von Sponeck, sat in full uniform, his Knight's Cross visible at his throat, a decoration for bravery now worn by a man accused of cowardice. The proceedings would be swift. In Nazi Germany's military justice system, the verdict was often decided before the trial began. The presiding judge was none other than Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the same man with whom Sponeck had crossed paths during the Fritsch-Blomberg affair years earlier. Whether Göring remembered that encounter, whether personal animosity played a role in what followed, remains speculation. What is documented is that Göring approached the trial with predetermined severity. He had reportedly stated before the proceedings that defeatist generals needed to be made examples of. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Sponeck had received a direct order from the Führer to hold his positions on the Kerch Peninsula. He had instead ordered a retreat. The fact of disobedience was not in dispute. Sponeck freely admitted he had ordered the withdrawal. The only question was whether this constituted cowardice or legitimate military judgment. Sponeck's defense was equally direct. He presented the tactical situation as it had existed on December 28, the overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, the landings behind his lines, the threat of complete encirclement, the exhausted state of his troops. He argued that preserving the division for future operations was more valuable than letting it be destroyed in a hopeless position. He had acted not from cowardice but from military necessity. Several officers testified on Sponeck's behalf, describing the impossible situation on the ground. They spoke of Soviet tanks breaking through thin defensive lines, of units down to 20% strength, of men literally freezing to death at their posts. But their testimony carried little weight against the fundamental charged disobedience of a Führer order. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty of cowardice in the face of the enemy. The sentence, death by firing squad. Göring delivered it with what witnesses described as satisfaction. Another general had been brought to heel, another challenge to absolute obedience crushed. The message to other commanders was clear: no tactical situation, no matter how desperate, justified disobedience. But then came an unexpected intervention. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Wehrmacht High Command, and even some SS leaders argued for clemency. Not from any sympathy for Sponeck, but from practical concerns. Executing a holder of the Knight's Cross, a general who had saved his division, might damage morale. Other commanders might become overcautious, unwilling to take necessary risks. The regime needed competent military leaders, even disobedient ones. Hitler, after consideration, commuted the sentence to fortress imprisonment Festungshaft in German legal terminology. This was a special category of imprisonment traditionally reserved for political prisoners and those convicted of honorable crimes. Prisoners retained their military rank, could wear civilian clothes, and were segregated from common criminals. It was punishment but not dishonor, at least in theory. Sponeck was transferred to Germersheim Fortress, a 19th-century fortification on the Rhine that had been converted into a military prison. His cell was Spartan but not harsh. A bed, a desk, books were permitted. He could receive limited visits, correspond with family under censorship, and was treated with the respect due to his rank. For a man who had spent his entire adult life in military service, the forced inactivity was perhaps punishment enough. Through 1942 and 1943, as the war turned increasingly against Germany, Sponeck remained in his cell. Outside, the division he had saved continued fighting, validating his decision with every battle it survived. The Kerch Peninsula, which Hitler had ordered held at all costs, was eventually evacuated anyway. The Eastern Front collapsed in slow motion, each retreat larger than the one Sponeck had been condemned for ordering. He spent his time reading, writing letters to his family, and perhaps reflecting on the choices that had brought him there. Did he think about the orders he had signed for the roundup of Jews in Ukraine? Did he connect his current imprisonment with the imprisonment and death he had facilitated for thousands of civilians? The historical record is silent on his inner thoughts during these years. July 20, 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's briefcase bomb exploded in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. The heavy oak table that deflected the blast saved Hitler's life, though 4 others died in the explosion. Within hours, the broader conspiracy collapsed. Stauffenberg was shot that same evening in Berlin. The Gestapo's investigation rapidly expanded, pulling in hundreds, then thousands of suspects. Hans Graf von Sponeck, sitting in his cell at Germersheim, had no connection to the July 20th plot. He had been imprisoned for over 2 years, with no ability to participate in any conspiracy even had he wished to. His name appeared on no lists of conspirators, no testimonies implicated him, no evidence suggested any involvement. He was simply a forgotten general serving a sentence for a tactical decision made in 1941. But the aftermath of July 20th was about more than punishing actual conspirators. It was about terror, about demonstrating the price of any disobedience, about closing any gaps in absolute loyalty to the Führer. Himmler, now given broad powers to purge the military, ordered a review of all existing military prisoners. Anyone whose past showed any sign of disloyalty, any questioning of orders, was to be eliminated. Sponeck's case file was pulled and reviewed. Here was a general who had directly disobeyed a Führer order. The fact that he had already been tried and sentenced was irrelevant. The commutation of his death sentence now looked like weakness, a failure to enforce proper discipline. In the paranoid atmosphere following the assassination attempt, any act of disobedience, no matter how long ago, was seen as part of a pattern of disloyalty that had culminated in the bomb plot. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and one of the most powerful men in the crumbling Reich, took particular interest in Sponeck's case. Bormann had long advocated for harsher treatment of defeatist generals. He argued that leaving such men alive even in prison sent the wrong message. They might become rallying points for discontent, symbols of resistance to the Führer's will. On July 22, just 2 days after the failed assassination, orders were transmitted to Germersheim. The original death sentence against General Hans Graf von Sponeck was to be carried out immediately. No new trial was necessary. Technically, he was still under a death sentence that had merely been suspended. The commandant of Germersheim Fortress received the order with the highest priority classification. Sponeck was informed of the decision on the morning of July 23. Witnesses later reported that he received the news calmly, without surprise. Perhaps he had been expecting this moment since his original sentencing. Perhaps he recognized that in the chaos consuming the Reich, his individual fate was merely a footnote. He was given a few hours to write final letters to his family. The execution was set for that same morning. There would be no ceremony, no final statement, no military honors despite his rank. A firing squad was assembled from the garrison troops at Germersheim. These were not frontline soldiers but garrison troops, many of them older men or those recovering from wounds, assigned to guard duty. They were about to execute a general who had won the Knight's Cross for bravery. The bitter irony of the moment could not have been lost on those present. Here was a general being shot not for the thousands of civilian deaths he had facilitated in Ukraine, not for his participation in genocide, but for the military decision to save his own men from certain destruction. The regime that had ordered him to participate in mass murder was now executing him for refusing to allow his soldiers to be needlessly slaughtered. Dawn came early to Germersheim on July 23, 1944. The fortress prison, built in more civilized times when military honor meant something different, prepared for an execution that would have been unthinkable to its 19th-century builders. The courtyard where the firing squad assembled had probably hosted military parades and ceremonies. Now it would witness the Wehrmacht executing one of its own generals. Sponeck was awakened before sunrise. He dressed carefully in his uniform, though stripped of insignia except his rank. The Knight's Cross he had worn at his trial was not permitted now. He was offered breakfast but declined, accepting only a cup of coffee. The chaplain arrived to offer last rites and Sponeck accepted, spending several minutes in private prayer. The letters he had written the night before were collected for censorship and eventual delivery. One to his wife, one to his son Hans Christoph, who was just 5 years old, too young to understand why his father would never come home. In these final letters, Sponeck maintained his composure, writing of duty, of acceptance, of hope that his family would understand he had acted according to his conscience. At precisely 7 a.m., guards arrived to escort him to the courtyard. Sponeck walked steadily, refusing the blindfold that was offered. He would face his death as he had faced Soviet armies, with his eyes open. The firing squad, 12 men selected from the garrison, stood at attention. Their commanding officer, whose name history has mercifully forgotten, read the execution order in a monotone voice. The Protestant chaplain spoke a brief prayer. Sponeck was positioned against the wall, declining to be tied to the post that had been prepared. He stood at attention, a soldier to the end. The commanding officer raised his sword. The riflemen raised their weapons. 12 rifles, though tradition held that one would be loaded with a blank so no man could be certain he had fired a fatal shot. Ready? The rifle steadied. Aim. 12 rifles pointed at the chest of a German general, holder of the Knight's Cross, a man who had saved thousands of German soldiers and facilitated the murder of thousands of Jewish civilians. The moral complexities of his life were about to be reduced to the simplicity of death. Fire. The volley crashed across the courtyard. Sponeck fell immediately, death likely instantaneous. The medical officer stepped forward to confirm what everyone already knew. At 7:03 a.m. on July 23, 1944, General Hans Graf von Sponeck was officially declared dead. The firing squad was dismissed. The body was removed for burial. Initially, Sponeck was buried in the prison cemetery at Germersheim, a simple grave marked only with his name and dates. No military honors, no recognition of rank, no acknowledgement of his service. Just another casualty of a regime that was entering its death throes, lashing out at real and imagined enemies as the Allied armies closed in from both east and west. The men who carried out the execution returned to their duties. Within months, many would be dead themselves as the Rhine defenses collapsed. The commandant who had signed the execution order would later claim he was merely following orders, the same defense Sponeck might have used for his actions in Ukraine. The spiral of moral compromise that had begun with cooperation in genocide had ended with Germans executing Germans. The war ended less than 10 months after Sponeck's execution. In May 1945, the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash. The men who had ordered his death, Hitler, Himmler, Bormann, were dead by their own hands or soon to hang for their crimes. Göring, who had presided over Sponeck's trial, would cheat the hangman with a cyanide capsule. The regime that had demanded absolute obedience unto death had itself died, unmourned and undefended. In 1952, Sponeck's remains were exhumed from Germersheim and reinterred at the military cemetery in Daun, in the Palatinate forest. This time, there was a proper military funeral, attended by former officers and men from the 22nd Infantry Division. They remembered him as the general who had saved them from certain death on the Kerch Peninsula, who had chosen their lives over blind obedience. For decades after the war, Sponeck's story was told primarily through this lens, the competent general executed by a criminal regime for making the right military decision. Wehrmacht veterans associations honored his memory. Military historians cited his case as an example of the impossible position German officers faced, caught between military necessity and political fanaticism. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's new army, even named a barracks after him, the General Graf Sponeck Kaserne in Germersheim, on the grounds where he had been imprisoned and executed. But history is never satisfied with simple narratives. As Cold War tensions eased and archives opened, historians began examining the Wehrmacht's role in the Holocaust more critically. The comfortable myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the notion that the regular army had fought a conventional war while the SS committed atrocities, crumbled under the weight of documentary evidence. Sponeck's signature on orders facilitating mass murder could not be ignored. The cooperation between the 22nd Infantry Division and the Einsatzgruppen was documented beyond dispute. The roundups in Melitopol, the killings in Feodosia, the systematic murder of Jewish civilians, all of this was part of the historical record. The general who had saved his soldiers had also participated in genocide. In the 1990s and 2000s, public memory began to shift. The man who had been seen primarily as a victim of Nazi injustice was increasingly recognized as also a perpetrator of Nazi crimes. Veterans groups protested, arguing that Sponeck had merely been following orders, ironically, the same argument that had failed to save him from execution. Historians countered that following criminal orders did not absolve moral responsibility. The debate reached a crescendo in 2015. After years of discussion, parliamentary hearings and historical review, the Bundeswehr made a decision. On June 22, 2015, symbolically, the anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the General Graf Sponeck Kaserne was renamed Sutfalls Kaserne. The ceremony was subdued, acknowledging both the complexity of history and the impossibility of honoring someone who had participated in genocide. Yet even this resolution feels incomplete. Sponeck's son, Hans Graf von Sponeck, grew up to become a distinguished diplomat, serving as United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. During his tenure, he faced his own moral crisis, resigning in 2000 to protest UN sanctions that he believed were causing humanitarian catastrophe. The son, like the father, chose conscience over obedience, though in his case the choice meant resignation rather than execution. The story of Hans Graf von Sponeck resists easy categorization. He was simultaneously a war criminal and a victim of a criminal regime. He saved thousands of soldiers and participated in the murder of thousands of civilians. He showed moral courage in disobeying an order that would have led to military disaster, yet showed no recorded hesitation in following orders that led to humanitarian catastrophe. He was executed not for his crimes but for his moment of military wisdom. How do we judge such a life? How do we weigh tactical brilliance against moral failure, personal courage against institutional complicity? Perhaps the answer is that we don't resolve these contradictions but rather hold them all in view simultaneously. Sponeck was neither simply hero nor simply villain, but a man who made choices, some admirable, some abhorrent, within a system that ultimately destroyed both its enemies and its servants. The final irony may be this: the Wehrmacht that executed Sponeck for disobedience would have been better served by more such disobedience. Had more generals refused criminal orders, had more officers chosen military wisdom over political orthodoxy, perhaps the destruction that consumed Germany might have been lessened. But that would have required a different kind of courage than military courage, the courage to recognize and resist evil even when it wears the uniform of your own nation. History's judgment remains unsettled, and perhaps that's as it should be. Some stories don't have clean endings or clear moral lessons. Sometimes the most we can do is tell the story fully, document what happened, and leave readers to grapple with the complexities. Hans Graf von Sponeck's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how the same person can be both perpetrator and victim, both moral and immoral, both courageous and compromised. The firing squad that assembled on July 23, 1944, executed a man whose life embodied all the contradictions of Wehrmacht service under the Nazi regime. In trying to understand that life and that death, we are forced to confront not just the extremes of human behavior but the vast gray area in between, where most of history actually takes place. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that history is rarely as simple as we might wish it to be, and that understanding the past requires us to hold multiple truths in our minds simultaneously, even when those truths seem irreconcilable.